Welcome everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the webinar moderator today for Keeping Invasive Plants Out of the Landscaping. This is one of the presentations we're offering in the Focus on Sustainability webinar series. This series was developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on this series, the webinars expand the reach of our individual programs. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups throughout the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, and Eco-Landscape California. If you have a question for the presenter, you may ask it at any time by typing in your question pane, and questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Doug Johnson. Doug holds degrees in geography and mechanical engineering and is the executive director of the nonprofit California Invasive Plant Council. Along with overseeing the Invasive Plant Council programs, he currently serves on the executive board for the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils and was the first chairperson of California's Invasive Species Advisory Committee. Welcome, Doug.
Great, thank you, Penny. Very excited to be here with the opportunity to connect with the ecological and conservation landscape community. And looking at the web pages of the partner groups here, I feel like there's a lot of synergistic overlap with the community of professional and volunteer land managers working to address the spread of invasive plants. So yes, I'm executive director of the California Invasive Plant Council. We are a small environmental nonprofit of 5 staff people. We've been around since 1992, and we work with a lot of partners. We are a true council. We're built on collaboration. So today I'm going to talk about one of our main collaborations with other groups through the PlantRight partnership, and that is I think a useful model for potentially other areas to draw from, excuse me, for reducing the use of invasive plants in landscaping. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues at PlantRight. Jan Merriweather, Stephanie Falzone, and Christina Kohler all helped put together this presentation. So first, let me tell you what I'm going to tell you. I want to start by giving some background on invasive plants and the work being done to address them, and then talk a bit about the role of horticulture and the work that's being done to make sure that horticulture and natural lands management work together from the same playbook. So who is Cal-IPC? Cal-IPC is a membership organization, and we have about 600 members right now. Typically, for the most part, these are professional land managers, but they also include volunteers who are particularly concerned about invasive plants in California's wildlands. So we have pictures here of, starting in the top left, crew members from the state agency CAL FIRE working on some arundo. To the right of that, a county agricultural commissioner staff person taking samples of a weed along a roadway. And so our local counties have staff that are dedicated to working on invasive plants. And then on the far right top, a land manager for the National Park Service working at Yosemite National Park. You can see Half Dome peeking through the hills there. So we have federal agencies, local agencies, state agencies all working on this. And at the bottom, we have different volunteer groups. We have on the bottom left, community groups like the Friends of Five Creeks work party shown here in the San Francisco Bay Area, youth groups, education, school groups like the class working in Bologna wetlands in the middle, and on the far right, conservation corps, state-run as well as nonprofit local conservation corps, young people getting their high school diploma and learning valuable job skills. So there's a range of folks working on invasive plants. In addition to the folks shown here, of course we have private reserves like land trusts. We have working lands like ranches where people are controlling invasive plants. We are one of many invasive plant councils around the United States. Each of the, almost all of the states shown here have their own invasive plant council, and then the colors, this is a screenshot from the website of the National Association of now IPCs, Invasive Plant Councils. It was formerly the National Association of Exotic Pest Plant Councils. Each of the states has their own council, and then regionally, based on the represented with the colors here, there are also groups of state invasive plant councils that work together. And the states that don't have invasive plant councils have plenty of active work going on as well. But the role of invasive plant councils is really one of coordination, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So, quick background and reminder review of what an invasive species is. There are two basic parts of the definition of an invasive species. It's a species that is non-native, and it is a species that causes harm. Now, non-native meaning it's only in a particular region because humans moved it there. It did not get there through other natural processes. And typically that's movement over a long distance. Of the invasive plants we have in California, almost all of them are from other continents. And harm is defined in federally by an executive order from 1999 and recently updated by outgoing President Obama in a new executive order, includes harm to the environment, harm to the economy, and harm to human health. So what kind of harm? I mean, what really is the problem with invasive species? Well, there's harm to wildlife, direct harm like diseases that can damage wildlife populations, or new species that compete with them for food and other resources. Recreation is a picture here shown of fishing as one form of recreation, and aquatic invasive species can interfere with that. Infrastructure, this is a bridge blown out by giant reed, Arundodonax, that we saw the CAL FIRE folks working on earlier, that has been moved downstream in a flood event. Agricultural impacts, of course. Rangelands can be degraded by invasive plants that reduce the productivity of the rangeland, and other impacts to agriculture, certainly crop pests, insects, etc. And water supplies can be impacted. Typically, the amount of water, but also water quality can be impacted. And fire here in California is also a big issue, and invasive species can have a role in spreading wildfire. So there are a number of impacts. The main impact that the invasive plant councils are concerned about is impact on the ecology of an area, the biodiversity. And it's widely believed through the entire literature, scientific literature on invasive species, that it is second to actually just paving over habitat and destroying habitat. It is the greatest threat to biodiversity. So that's a pretty significant role, one that not necessarily everybody fully appreciates. Just to give you a quick idea of some of the invasive plants here in California, on the top left is Scotch broom, here growing in a utility right-of-way. And Scotch broom, like other broom species, is a woody legume, and here it's obviously spreading through a disturbed area in the right-of-way, and it is a fire danger. It changes soil chemistry, being a nitrogen fixer, and it also grows pretty well on coastal chaparral and in areas where it's not disturbed, so pretty good habitat. It's pretty good at invading those areas as well. So besides being a fire danger, it crowds out native plants to support native wildlife. To the right on top, again, is Arundodonax giant reed, which grows in a lot of California's coastal waterways. It grows right in the water and destroys riparian habitat, can contribute to flood damage, changes the hydrology of the waterway, and also is a fire spreader. So typically riparian areas aren't sources of fires, but given the fuels from dried arundo and also in some cases encampments of homeless people, there can be an ignition source, and so we've had fires that have started in riparian areas for the first time ever. Bottom left, water hyacinth, that's not a meadow, that's a slough covered with an aquatic plant, and obviously it's would make passage with boats impossible, and so we have a big problem in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta with aquatic plants. And on the bottom right, what we often refer to as our state weed, yellow star thistle, which covers some 14 million acres in California. About 14% of California is infested with yellow star thistle, and it degrades rangeland productivity, and it also consumes excess water above and beyond what native grassland plants would consume. And of course, there are hundreds of species nationwide, different plants in different areas, depending on their climates and other growing conditions. And this is an example of an invasive plant where the damage, the ecological damage it's causing is visually obvious. You know, it's a kudzu-like plant that covers all other vegetation and basically denies it light and kills it. And but it's an example of the rare plant where its impacts are visually obvious. Unfortunately, the impacts for many plants are not ones that you would just notice by looking at them, and in fact many of them are pretty attractive in the landscape if you don't know better. So that's something to be aware of. Whoops. Okay. So as I mentioned, it's a national effort, and that means not only is it going on, this kind of work, managing invasive plants and other invasive species, going on everywhere around the country, it's also a problem that needs to be dealt with at the landscape level. It needs to be dealt with across state boundaries, political boundaries. And so not only are states and regions working together here, but there's a push to collect data nationally, to share distribution data about weeds, where weeds are and aren't nationally. It's also, invasive species is a huge international issue. The United States has its share of problems, but so do all the other places in the world. And one of the things that drives that home is when we here in California work with other Mediterranean climate regions around the world, where we have some of their weeds, some of their plants here, but then some of our plants here, some of our native plants here are actually invasive in their areas as well. So things have been shuffled around the globe, and everybody's having to deal with it. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity, as you can see here, requires that basically each country prevents the spread of invasive species. And a recent, every 4 years, a conservation congress is held. This last year it was in Hawaii, and invasive species were one of the topics that they considered. As I mentioned, there needs to be lots of collaboration across political boundaries. There also needs to be collaboration across jurisdictional boundaries. And so at the national level, as shown by the plan on the left, and at the state level, as shown by the example from California on the right, there are collaborative entities putting together plans for coordination to make sure that gaps are covered as much as possible, and that we look for synergy in our efforts. And I would say from my experience in the field, this is a sign of moving in the right direction, but we have a long ways to go. There are plenty of gaps, and unfortunately, given political structures, it's difficult to create new programs or new coordination where it doesn't exist before. So I think good work is happening, but there's lots and lots that needs to happen for it to be truly effective. And that's one of the roles of the invasive plant councils that I mentioned. We came to exist in part because there was a need to share information about this new field of managing invasive plants in natural areas as opposed to agricultural areas, but also because there was an acknowledgement of the need to collaborate on working together across jurisdictional boundaries to make sure that the problems were solved. Invasive plants, as we mentioned earlier, and invasive species have an impact on wildlife, and so wildlife planning, each state is required to have a state wildlife action plan or SWAP. Wildlife planning considers the impacts of invasive species, and California acknowledges that they are one of the top impacts to wildlife. Climate adaptation, looking at protecting wildlife, is also looking at the role of invasive species, and it comes up in several ways. One is the need to control existing ecological stressors up front in order to protect wildlife from changing climate, but also the fact that a changing climate may favor generalists like invasive species at the expense of native species that we're trying to protect, and to look for opportunities to protect climate refugia, wildlife corridors, etc. So what's being done? One of the main things is prioritization. So which species, this is a cover shot of California's invasive plant list, which plants are a problem and which of those are the biggest problem, which are becoming a problem, which are spreading rapidly. All of that assessment helps to prioritize the resources that we have to go after invasive plants, because obviously we can't do everything, so we have to figure out which things are going to have the greatest conservation outcome. Spatial prioritization is also important. This is a bit of a busy graphic, but this is a screenshot from a tool called Cal-IPC that we put together with support from the U.S. Forest Service, and it maps invasive plants across California. It also maps suitable range based on climate, both now and looking into the future with a changing climate. Where do we expect that range to expand or contract? So there are spatial tools like this that help us prioritize within a given area which species make the most sense to go after. Of course, finding new species early is important. It's not a static problem where we have all the invasive plants that we're ever going to have. New plants are being introduced all the time. Plants that have been here a long time and haven't spread begin to adapt and start to spread. So the concept of early detection and rapid response, or EDRR, is a core principle of invasive species management. And of course, better than finding them early is keeping them from getting here at all. There's a picture here of ballast water discharge, which you may or may not have heard of, but estuaries like the San Francisco Bay are infested with organisms from around the world because those organisms have hitchhiked on shipping typically, and one of the ways that happens is through ballast water in the hold. So as we all know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and with invasive species management that means addressing pathways of introduction and spread. Introduction means bringing it to the new place, that human agency I mentioned earlier. So at this point I'm going to transition, and if we were live I would ask you to conjecture what you think the top pathway for introduction of invasive plants is, but you probably can guess the answer to that. Oops, there it is. So this in studies here in California is our best understanding of where invasive plants have come from, and you can see that the biggest slice of the pie is horticulture. So while we have inadvertent introductions through things like seed contaminant, bringing bales of hay over from somewhere else, another continent that have weed seeds in them, the primary way that invasive plants have been introduced is through horticulture. Not by any nefarious designs, of course, but that's where things have come from. And it's not surprising. The plant features that are desirable for a successful horticultural plant read very much like the features that you might assume a successful invasive plant would have. You want plants that are able to establish and grow quickly. They're easy to propagate. Their reproduction is straightforward. Maybe they can be easily reproduced by seed or by cuttings and other fragments. They're tolerant to a wide variety of soil and water conditions. Ideally, they bloom for a long time, so they're pretty, and it also helps their reproduction, and they're resistant to pest damage. Unfortunately, well, and here in California, of course, water efficient landscaping is a really big deal, and so you want something that doesn't need a lot of irrigation, which is great in the landscape, but for the few plants that may escape to grow in the wild and spread, that's part of their ability to do that. So one of the first thoughts that occurs to people when they realize, well, horticulture is a source of invasive plants in wildlands, and largely it's a historical source, but there are still plants for sale that are problematic in wildlands. Well, why don't we just make them illegal? Isn't that the simple solution? And it isn't that simple. For one reason, the determination of what is an invasive plant is not a black and white issue. It's a whole spectrum. What are the known impacts? What are the anticipated impacts? And how sure are you that those are going to come about? How beloved a plant is it, or how important is it economically to the nursery trade? Those are all factors that come into play. Also things like, well, it might be invasive in this part of the state, but not problematic in that part of the state. It is a very complicated picture. And so we, Cal-IPC and partners, initially took the approach of working with the green industry to develop materials for education and outreach. And so the Don't Plant a Pest brochures, which were developed for different regions of California, were developed to not only identify the handful of invasive plant species that are still in the trade, but to offer lots of alternatives. Safe alternatives that they may be native, they may be non-native, but they aren't known to be invasive, and they can fulfill the same role in the landscape. This was back in the early 2000s. This is a pretty common approach at this point. We had lots of support in doing this, which really pushed it forward. Progressive organizations like the Bay Friendly Landscaping Coalition through local governments here in the Bay Area were pushing for everything from keeping contaminants out of streams to water efficiency to not using invasives. So they were very interested in this. And then professionals through organizations like the American Society of Landscape Architects were also very interested in incorporating this into their design. So for instance, the San Diego chapter of the ASLA put a lot of time into identifying local invasive plants that should not be used as part of the water efficient guidelines there. So the PlantRight partnership was initiated in 2005, and it came about through a couple of currents. One is that Sustainable Conservation is a very active nonprofit located in San Francisco that works in California, and their goal is to basically work with the business community and the environmental community to make sure that the business community is really doing what it needs to be ecologically friendly. So they've worked on Central Valley issues with dairies and methane digesters. They've worked on brake pads, getting copper out of brake pads here, and other partnerships where, because of their good standing in working with the business community as well as the environmental community, they can really bridge that that gap. And so they pulled together the Cal-HIP partnership, the California Horticultural Invasives Prevention Partnership. And the next slide shows a whole bunch of the types of groups that are involved in that. But a key is that the stated goal from the beginning and at every meeting since then, the reminder, this is about voluntary measures. This is not about regulation. And that is part of the foundation that really allows businesses to get involved without fearing that they're going to suffer legally. So it's a mix of industry partners from big box stores like Lowe's and Home Depot, growers like Monrovia, industry representatives like American Hort and the California Association of Nurseries and Garden Centers, designers, and like I believe that's the Association of Professional Landscape Designers, and then nonprofits, typically environmental nonprofits. So Cal-IPC is in there, the Native Plant Society is in there, TNC is in there, but also the Farm Bureau, and so nonprofits that might represent parts of the industry as well. And then government agencies that are involved with invasive plants. So CACASA is the association for those county agricultural commissioners I mentioned. And then the State Department of Food and Agriculture. In California, historically, weeds have been through the Department of Food and Agriculture. One of the evolutions in California, I think, is for the Department of Natural Resources, or the Natural Resources Agency, to get more involved on the environmental impacts, but they don't have the regulatory say-so. So CDFA works with nurseries commonly, as do the county agricultural commissioners, and then the science end, mostly from academia, but from botanic gardens as well, and the Horticultural Research Institute has supported some projects through PlantRight. So I want to talk about a few of the main current projects that PlantRight is working on. An annual survey of retail nurseries throughout the state, a retail nursery partnership whereby those nurseries who are interested in engaging can adopt the PlantRight pledge, and then third, plant risk evaluation through a new tool called PRE, for Plant Risk Evaluator. So just before we talk about that, some of the plants listed in California, so of course to do something like survey retail nurseries for invasive plants, you have to know what you're looking for. You have to know what we all agree is an invasive plant. So that was one of the first things that Cal-HIP did in the foundation of PlantRight, was to reach consensus on what we all agree are problem plants that are still in horticulture. And so that started from everybody looking at the Cal-IPC inventory, which I showed early, so our science-based list, and agreeing that yes, that is solid. We all understand how that list is developed. We don't think it's partisan in some way. You know, some environmentalist lists of the plants they don't like. It's based on an evaluation of impacts, and that included, we went out for field trips and other things that where people, especially from the horticultural trade, like we went to the Point Reyes National Seashore, where people could see the impacts themselves and understand, okay, I've seen this plant in landscaping, but I've never seen it in the wild. That's really something. So that helped build the confidence in assessments of invasive plants. So taking Cal-IPC's long list and whittling it down to the ones where everyone felt like these are definitely a problem and they're still in the nursery. So ice plant, which you see all over California's beaches, Vinca major, which is a problem here. I think Vinca minor is a pretty big problem on the East Coast. Pennisetum, green fountain grass, which is something that unfortunately has been planted a lot as a drought-tolerant plant. Pampas grass, which is shown here in a pot, but if you've seen it along the California coast, it gets huge, like 10 feet tall, and it's all along Highway 1. Mexican feathergrass, which I starred here to talk about later, because that's a special addition to the PlantRight list, and that also is a popular water-efficient choice. Water hyacinth, as I showed earlier, in the Delta, and yellow water iris is another aquatic plant. So the 2016 version of the spring survey, I believe it was the 7th year that it was conducted, visited a lot of nurseries around the state. I think the next slide says how many nurseries, but I think it's a couple hundred. So a fair sampling. I can't remember what percentage that is, but it's a pretty high percentage, and determined what was present at those. And so a fair number, as you can see, I have green squares saying that none of the species that were being surveyed for were found there. And then the red ones had some invasive species. Oop. I see, this is animated. Anyway, 175 volunteers typically from master gardeners organizations, and 302 stores. Oh boy. Okay, let me go ahead and populate this. So this was surveying a number of different types of outlets. So big box stores like Orchard Supply, small chains, so these are groups of 3 or 5 stores around a metropolitan area, as well as independent individual stores. And this is a chart of progress on several different groups of plants, but basically the green line, the lower line that starts back in 2011, shows that over the course of these nursery surveys, the percentage of stores that have invasive plants has gone down significantly. And it's a little bit tricky to say, well, that's because of all the outreach we've been doing, but we are taking credit for that. So moving to the retail nursery partnership, this is where individual nurseries decide that they will play ball with PlantRight, and what they commit to is basically taking that list of invasives and saying, okay, we're not going to sell any of those, and we'll provide the alternatives to people. And all of our staff, especially the buyers, the people who are making the selection of what plants we're going to carry here, go through an online training. And that's a well-developed course online that PlantRight provides. And what the stores get in return is they get some expertise and resources that they can refer to. So this isn't a punitive program. This is supportive. And if they need information on good alternatives, we can provide that. And they get an online listing, and they get some materials with the logo that allow them to use it in their marketing if they so wish. Currently, they've got 24 partner organizations representing 461 storefronts in California who are participating, and these are a few of them shown here. And I think Cal-IPC's angle has really been to work with the kind of the consumer and the retailer primarily to educate them, like with the Don't Plant a Pest brochures. One of the things that PlantRight has been able to do, and Sustainable Conservation with its organization has been able to do, is to move back to the growers who are behind the scenes and the buyers who are making the decisions, especially for a large big box store where the quantities can really drive the market, to really work with them on what it would take to move particular plants out of production, and to give them the time for that, but to keep pushing them along. So the third of the 3 things, and let me just, this is my cue to remind you that we're nearing the end of the presentation, and I would welcome any questions at the end. And the way to ask a question is to type it into the chat box on your screen. So please feel free to think of your questions now and start putting them in so that we can talk about them at the end. So the plant risk evaluation tool was developed by UC Davis researchers and University of Washington researchers. And there are lots of tools around the world, and by tool I mean a set of criteria, a set of questions that you answer that help you determine the risk posed by a particular plant. And the foundation of most of those is the Australian system. And Australia is one of the strictest countries, basically limiting whatever comes in unless it can be proved safe, as opposed to needing to prove it problematic before you can't bring it in, which is more the approach we have in the US. That system had 49 questions, which is thorough, but it also, they're willing to pay people to go through it, and that takes time and expertise. So this pre-tool has whittled it down to 20 questions that have been tested to not produce, to be very accurate, to not produce false positives and false negatives, to not say, hey, we think this plant's going to be invasive when in fact it isn't, or to say, hey, we think this plant's going to be safe when it isn't. The USDA federally has also has a complex tool similar to the Australian tool that they use for evaluating potential imports sometimes, and this tool was built on full knowledge of that tool as well. So it's really a condensation, and one of the nice things is that PlantRight has funded UC Davis to put the tool online in a user-friendly way such that one can answer the questions and it will generate the scores for you. And it's a point system where if you score, as you can see at the legend at the bottom, over a certain level is a high risk of invasiveness, and that would mean, hey, if you're a nursery, you probably don't want to invest money into that plant as a new commodity. And then there's a middle section where it's too close to call, and there's a lower section where if you score less than 13 points, it's like, okay, that's a low enough risk of invasiveness that you're probably safe to introduce it and not worry about it becoming a problem someday. And so this tool was developed because the industry said nurseries need better tools to identify and qualify whether plants they introduce, produce, and distribute have the potential to become invasive. Basically, help us determine up front what plants might be problematic so we don't invest a bunch of money in them and then resist later when we're told that it's a problem and we shouldn't sell it. So we think this is a very important proactive approach, and I starred the Nacella tenuissima, the Mexican feathergrass, earlier because that plant was added to the list even though it is not widespread out in California's wildlands yet. All the other plants that are on PlantRight's list are plants that are widespread in wildlands. We know they're a problem. There's no question about that. It's actually somewhat questionable as to whether planting them more in horticulture is going to worsen the problem when it's already so bad, but taking the long-term view, since people are working on those plants that we think if they aren't used in horticulture and spread that way, and we are working on them in wildlands, that we can reduce the impact. But a plant like Mexican feathergrass is completely different. It's used widely in horticulture, at least in recent years, and it's been seen starting to escape, but it isn't out there causing huge impacts yet. And so this is a case where all partners, including the nursery partners, looked at the evidence and decided, even though this is a popular plant, we think that the evidence is strong enough that it's going to be a problem in the future, that we want to advocate not selling it. And so that's the approach being taken with this pre-tool, is to identify up front, even before seeing the evidence on the ground, being able to use a demonstrably accurate tool like the pre-tool, being able to gauge some of these things up front. So it's not only useful for evaluating new horticultural products, Cal-IPC is also using it for plants that are already here that have escaped into wildlands but aren't spreading yet. So there's plenty of non-native plants growing wild in California. Not all of those are listed as invasive because they haven't spread and had an impact, but you worry about whether they're going to spread and have an impact. And so we took 200 of those plants and recently, again with Forest Service funding, have run them through the pre-tool to evaluate which are the highest risk of becoming problematic in the future. So I'm nearing the end here, but one thing kind of beyond PlantRight that we see happening on the horizon is that green building codes more and more are including clauses for not planting invasive plants as part of your landscaping. So green building codes, started out with the energy efficiency of the building itself and have expanded to include the landscape and things like water efficiency. So when they say don't use invasive plants in landscaping, as California's Green Building Code does, they need to be able to, you need to know what are the invasive plants that you can't use in landscaping. So there needs to be a list that you can point to, and that needs to be a mutually agreed upon list. So that's where the collaborative project, the collaborative approach of something like PlantRight, where the environmental community and industry and government and academia come together and agree this is what the evidence says is a problem. That's a really important precedent for this. And so I think this will be kind of the next, it is quasi-regulatory because a community that adopts those green building codes is then requiring that, for instance, new commercial construction is the front that we're working on here in California, that those projects don't use invasive plants, and they will point to those lists. So it's a critical area, I think, for people in our community to have input to. So with that, I thank you for your time and your attention. You, of course, are invited to take a look at our website, which is in the process of being redone, but has lots of information on there, as well as the National Association of Invasive Plant Council's website, which links to all of the state invasive plant council's websites. I didn't put that URL on here, but you can certainly Google it, and I believe it's naeppc.org. And you can link to your own local state's invasive plant council if you aren't already in touch with it and see what's going on there. And of course, feel free to email me as well with any questions that pop to mind tomorrow or after this presentation. So thank you very much, and I'll entertain any questions that folks may have.
Thank you, Doug. That was very, very informative. We do have several questions from our listeners. The first is, not every non-native plant is a problem, obviously, since we have many non-native food crops and horticultural plants that are being used and not causing problems. What percentage of plants in horticulture do become invasive?
That is a good question. What is commonly used, it turns out, is the rule of 10. Typically of the non-native species, non-native plant species present in an area, one can expect over time that 10% of them can grow in the wild, basically escape cultivation, and that 10% of those then becomes a significant invasive plant problem. So you get 1% basically from that. Now, we haven't run the numbers on all of the horticultural plants ever used in California to see if the number of invasives is 1% of that, but that would be a decent educated guess. And so that the rule of 10 isn't something that somebody just came up with out of the blue. It's surprisingly fairly accurate in situations across the globe.
All right, thank you. The next question is, we're fairly familiar with some of the mechanical means of pulling invasives or spraying herbicides, both natural and non-natural. Are you seeing success with biocontrols or any other methods for controlling invasives?
Yes, definitely. And that's a good point about the herbicides. That's one of the educational tasks we have. A lot of the land managers in the state do employ the judicious use of herbicides as one of the tools in the IPM, Integrated Pest Management Toolbox. But there are other, besides just pulling a plant out and spraying herbicide on it, there are lots of other tools that people are looking to employ. So whether you're grazing it with goats or with livestock of any sort, one form of biocontrol, but classical biocontrol is going to the home range of the plant and looking for the insects typically, and sometimes pathogens that damage the plant in its homeland, and investigating whether those are safe to bring here. And so that typically involves a decade plus of research to try those potential biological control agents out on all the other plants that are similar to the plant you do want to control. And the USDA and Fish and Wildlife Service and others have a very high bar for bringing something new in that it can't damage anything else. So that's one tool that can actually have an impact at the landscape scale for plants that have spread beyond our ability to control them by pulling them out and spraying them with herbicide and that kind of thing. And then of course there's fire. In California, fire is a natural part of the landscape, and in most other places too, with different frequencies. And so it's a difficult tool to use in populous areas, but that's also a tool that's used to look at managing invasive plants.
Okay. The next question is about PlantRight. Is this something that you are anticipating will become a national organization and will be seeing in the Northeast, for instance, where I am?
That's a good question too. I think that could be very effective, but there are, just like all the plants are different across the country and the organizations have their differences, the approach, although I think it will have some common themes, will need to be different in different regions as well. And PlantRight is, like any nonprofit organization, they need to look out for mission creep and only do what they can do. So I think to date, being a California-based organization, that's where their focus will remain. But the pre-tool is one tool that has been looked at for use nationally, and looking at university partners, horticultural departments at universities and botanic gardens and others that can use that pre-tool to help nursery partners evaluate potential new plants. The tool has built-in privacy measures so that if, for instance, if a nursery wants to look into a plant that, it feels like it's kind of proprietary information that they're even exploring that plant, the tool is set up to handle that. That said, I think there are programs not identical to PlantRight, but on the same spirit that are happening in lots of places. They are driven by state agencies in some cases. They're driven by nonprofits in other cases. But I think the engagement between the environmental community and the green industry is happening all over.
All right, thank you. We have many more questions along the same line. One is specifically asking if you know of a similar program in the Northeast, or if that's something that we should research on our own.
I don't off the top of my head, and I would be happy to get back to you, Penny, if there's a way of getting the information out. But I think, yeah, some quick Google research would turn that up, and talking to the invasive plant councils in the region is a good way to get there quickly as well. I know some of the states in the Mid-Atlantic have adopted programs. My memory is telling me that Massachusetts and Connecticut have probably done something as well on a perhaps even a more formal level with setting lists at the state level as opposed to a voluntary measure like what PlantRight is working on. So I don't think there's formally a central place to look for all of those collaborations, unfortunately. It is a rapidly evolving area, but I think connecting with the Invasive Plant Council in one's region is probably the fastest way to figure out what the current efforts are. Okay, great. We have a few questions about how you built consensus. The first one is, how long did it take to come to consensus on the problematic plants, and what was the process? That's a key part of the whole whole deal. So sustainable conservation, again, by virtue of their reputation for being a square dealer with business, was able to bring in key representatives from the industry and really facilitate a trusting dialogue and acknowledge continuously what the needs were from each community, but especially the business needs, and appealing to those in the business community who, although cautious, really want to do what's right by the environment. So it took a while. I would say it took a meeting over a year to 2 years to really get the baseline trust in place, but that had been preceded by Cal-IPC's work on the Don't Plant a Pest project, developing those brochures, where we had already engaged some representatives of the nursery trade to help propose alternatives that they thought would be suitable, and also ones that they thought would be good for business. I mean, they're available. They're already in the trade. We don't want to propose some obscure plant that you can't get. By having already engaged a few of those folks and them having some baseline trust in us, I think that each successive phase built upon the one before. So, and in terms of determining the list of plants, that took a lot of effort as well. Things like English ivy, we have lots of ivy in our wildlands, but turns out, is it English ivy or Algerian ivy or Hedera hibernica, which is what they, I think, figured out in Washington State was primarily in their wildlands. It's too genetically confusing. There are those kind of issues that come up as well. Cordaderia celluina pampas grass is another challenging one. It's taken a long time to agree on. So I think it's definitely a long-term process, and one of the things that sustainable conservation is good at is recognizing that and taking what can happen at any given point and moving with that, and then organically going to the next level as it's possible. Whereas I think some of those of us on the environmental side would probably get frustrated earlier on and say, well, if we can't agree on this, then that's too problematic. So I think being in it for the long term is an important part of making the incremental progress.
All right. Are there any documents on your website that go into the detail of how you began these collaborations? Some of our audience are interested in specifics so that they can work with their local groups to see about creating something in other areas in the country.
Yeah, definitely. And before describing briefly what we did and what others can do, the folks that I mentioned at the beginning through sustainable conservation that work on PlantRight, they would be great resources to talk to as well, super friendly, and have colleagues around the country and also thoughts on collaboration. That's basically what their organization does. I think one of the keys initially is to find a trusted partner to serve as the convener, and in our case often that has been a botanic garden or a university horticulture department that gets the environmental issues and also gets horticulture and industry. And having them serve as a convener, bringing together the range of partners that I mentioned earlier. So the key agencies, the key environmental nonprofits, the key industry groups, and any industry allies, nursery folks that are also interested in biodiversity, local biodiversity, and then the academics as well. So bringing all those together and just discussing the problem, discussing everybody's needs and concerns, presenting perhaps an example of things that have happened elsewhere, like the PlantRight partnership. I have a feeling they'd be happy to present what they've done here in California to anybody, and kind of go from there. So not try to drive the agenda too quickly, but I think the example of coming up with a consensus list of plants that are still in the trade that can be agreed upon as problematic, and again, that was facilitated by going into the field and actually seeing some of those plants, like, oh, huh, okay, I never noticed that. I spent all my time, you know, in the urban area, and I hadn't gotten out here and seen, or, you know, maybe they're in areas that the public doesn't necessarily go in all the time. And seeing the plants growing in the wild and seeing that there is a problem, I think that's a key part. But then also the opposite, taking environmental land manager types and going to visit nurseries and gaining an appreciation for what goes on there. We've gone on a number of field trips. I would say every year we've had 1 or 2 field trips associated with the meetings. And gaining an appreciation for the level of plant knowledge these people have in the industry, and then an appreciation for the difficulties of the economics of making a living through the nursery trade. And not just their knowledge of plants, but their love of plants. And I think that's also one of the sources of bonding, is that if you're out at a nursery or you're out in wildlands and you're looking at plants, everybody's pretty fascinated because you care about plants. So I think that builds a base level of trust. And having meetings where you're having a lunch together or something also builds a bit of the camaraderie, which is not something I necessarily would have designed in. I'm a little bit more thinking about the business. Here's the meeting agenda, we're done. But I think PlantRight understands that connection between people is an important part of this moving forward too. So in hindsight, I would recommend designing that in as well.
That's a very, very good point. Establishing that community is part of the process. The next question is about climate change. Have you encountered any situations where there are invasive plants in areas outside of your state, but with climate change they may end up coming your way? And are you doing anything to address that in a proactive way?
In general, no. I think the situation exists certainly that plants are going to be moving around. Their range is going to shift with climate change. But if that's, I guess we figure even if climate change is anthropogenic, if plants are moving based on climate, we don't consider that the same as somebody picking up a plant in Eurasia somewhere and taking it across the ocean and plopping it down in California. So what we will be doing is working with scientists who are modeling where they expect vegetation to shift and trying to figure out ways to keep the invasive plants that are already here from allowing native plants to move where they need to move to survive. So if we have a plant across the border in Mexico that's native there and it starts to creep into California because it's now warmer up here, we wouldn't consider that invasive.
Okay. As part of your evaluation and checking into nurseries, are you looking at soil and evaluating the soil for invasive organisms like earthworms or other things?
That's one of the roles played by the county agricultural commissioners as they do nursery inspections. And I imagine it's similar in other states, but California has a list of species that cannot be introduced. They're pest species. And so that would include not only weed seeds, so if you got weeds popping up in the pot with another plant that's the actual commodity, they screen for that. Sudden oak death, Phytophthora species have been a big concern. So to the degree they can look for that or for the practices that help prevent the spread of that, they do. But for any of the known crop pests, nurseries can get quarantined for having any of those. Earthworms, I don't know if that is, I doubt that that's on the radar screen at this point. But yes, certainly nursery screening happens in part because that stuff can damage agriculture. So to the degree that anything can damage agriculture, the state's the state's trying to be on it. The trick is a little more with the things that might damage the environment and figuring out where the who has political jurisdiction over and the authority to handle that.
Okay. The next are two related questions about big box stores. The first is, do you ever experience resistance? You had the big box stores on one of your charts. Are you getting fairly good collaboration from them or pushback? And the follow-on question from another listener is, are you likely to see your PlantRight initiatives grow across the country to the big nationwide chains?
That would be my hope, that what we're undertaking here and that others are undertaking in their particular areas grows to where it becomes business as usual. I think partly that'll be an information challenge to make sure that it's not a patchwork of, okay, what can I sell where, but to have it be a pretty clear system to say, okay, these plants are okay in these regions, but not in these other regions. I feel like the participation of the big box stores has been a slow but strong part of this whole thing. Like I mentioned earlier, because of the quantities, they can really drive what gets grown by growers. And so trying to figure out who to talk to can be a challenge. But years ago, one of our first, and this was even before, I believe, before PlantRight started, one of our Cal-IPC members was frustrated that she had seen a particular plant in a store, and she was persistent, and she ended up over the phone getting a hold of the person who served as the buyer for this chain's stores in California, and that person said, oh yeah, I think I know that plant. That is, I have seen that growing in the wild. Okay, it's easy for me just to take that off the list. So that person just kind of unilaterally pulled it from the list of what stores could pick from their pull-down list to order, and voila, you know, it was no longer available. However, that was not a systematic approach, and as soon as that person was gone, you know, from that position, then, you know, who knows if that stays in place. So what PlantRight has really done is work with the national headquarters of Walmart and Lowe's and Home Depot to and Orchard to determine what it will take for them to adopt this formally. So that's taken a long time, but that's happened, and that's I think a really good sign, and a sign that they see that it's not a threat to their bottom line, and it's doing the right thing, and they can probably take some credit for it in their marketing. So I think as long as it doesn't become overly complex and it doesn't seem like it's going to, I mean, ideally it can increase the bottom line because of that marketing. I think they will continue to support that across the country. But that would be a really good question to know from PlantRight. I mean, I'm sure they would need to be somewhat diplomatic in how they answered, but to get their sense for where progress like what they've made here, where that's headed elsewhere across the country based on the progress here with those big box stores.
Okay. We are running over time, and I'm just going to wrap this up with one last question. Where does your funding come from, including funding for outreach materials?
So Cal-IPC's funding primarily comes, well, from grants, and of the grants, they're primarily public grants through agencies. So the State Wildlife Conservation Board, the Forest Service, as I mentioned, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We also have a few private foundation grants, but that's fairly few and far between. Unfortunately, I think environmental grant makers haven't quite realized the benefit of investing in invasive species management. And then we have, you know, our members and our donors. The PlantRight program, Sustainable Conservation, is more supported by private donors, and I think that just has to do with the history of how they've formed. But they have people who have money, often through industry, and who are very concerned about the environment, who support them. In terms of outreach materials, we have gotten funding from water agencies at times when they have outreach dollars that they can spend to print brochures, but we also have sold the brochures. So we give some away for free, but we ideally ask people to pay for them to cover the printing costs. And in a lot of cases, organizations can do that, whether they want to give them out through a garden tour or at a visitor center or their garden club. Often they can come up with the $25 or $30 to buy a pack of them and hand them out.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Doug, for sharing all of this important information and giving us all hope by enlightening us on the California initiatives, and hopefully these things will spread to other parts of the country as well. And thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.